what happens when teams just simply can't decide what to do? Well, let's take a look at what some of the experts at Harvard University have to say. What do you do and how do you get rid of it? There's actually several things that you can do. And we're going to be taking a look at Professor Bob Frisch's work. And the one thing I want to share with you right now is what is called Dictator by Default syndrome. We've all experienced this, where a group is asked to make a decision, but they can't decide. They hit what's called an impasse. So they go to the boss and say, we can't decide. And the CEO or the boss then gets upset at the executives or the team members because they're indecisive, they can't make a choice. But then the CEO or the boss makes the choice. Most people don't like the choice because the group couldn't agree anyhow. And so he or she is then treated like they're a dictator. This is actually called the voting paradox. And here's how it works. You're reaching collective decisions based on individual preferences is an imperfect science. This is where you go around the table and say, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? This is typically what we do. However, if you look at the math, when 3 or more people are attempting to set priorities among 3 or more items, so 3 people prioritizing 3 or more items, you almost always get an impasse. It's basically a mathematical problem. Now, this is what the voting paradox actually looks like. So take a look at the bottom of the chart. You see that Lou, Sue, and Stu, or Stuart, were asked which executive cars did they want for the executive team. They had a choice of a BMW, a Mercedes, or a Lexus. They could only buy one brand. Well, you could see that their first choice, they couldn't come to an agreement. Second choice, they couldn't come to an agreement. Third choice, they couldn't come either. So they went to the boss and said, we can't decide, you decide. Well, here's what happens. The boss can only choose one, too. So let's say he chooses Mercedes. Well, 2 out of the 3 people in the group aren't going to be happy because they wanted BMW or Lexus, which is where no one likes the boss's choice, and then he's considered or she's considered a dictator. So this actually doesn't work. However, let's talk about what does. We're looking to improve your team's decision-making process, so we actually need some models to go by. The first one, believe it or not, as simple as you'd think it would be there, it's not. Clearly articulate the outcome your team must achieve. Most people don't really know what they're trying to decide. They think they do, but when they find they can't make a decision, they look back at it later, they're like, oh, I thought I was deciding something else. Now, when people understand the goal, the more readily they will be able to agree on how to get there. So it's really clear. You have to be really clear on what people are deciding to do. A lot of assumptions are made on what we're trying to do. So use pre-meeting surveys to identify any areas of agreement or disagreement before the meeting so that when the meeting starts, you can kind of tell where are we going to have any deadlocks or disagreements. This can prevent stalemate. So it's kind of like having a meeting before the meeting. Hey, what do you think we should do? What do you think we should do? And we're trying to get the temperature of the room. Next is you need to also specify the desired outcome. So let's say we say the goal is to increase sales in a certain region. Okay, we now need to specify the desired outcome where maybe they say it needs to be at least a 5% increase, but we would really, really love it if it was a 100% increase because then you get a bonus. So specify the desired outcome to the team. Without clear desired outcomes, the team members choose options that are going to be based on unspoken, differing assumptions. This sets the stage for the dictator by default syndrome. So to avoid the syndrome, articulate exactly what you want the team to accomplish. This seems really common sense. Most teams don't do this. So when you look at this, ask yourself in the past, have we run into this problem too? I thought you were working on this. No, I thought we were working on that. Articulate clearly the outcome that you are seeking. So it is surprising how often executives assume that they're talking about the same thing when in fact they're actually talking about different things to each other. In a discussion for growth, for existence, the goal was growth. Some might be referring to growing revenue. Others might think, oh, I thought we were trying to grow market share. Others thought, I thought we were trying to grow net income. So this is where people get off track. Growth needs to be more specific on what you're trying to grow. So the discussion should begin with the agreement on what the outcome the team is trying to achieve. A great way to make sure that everyone understands is have everyone around the room say, this is what I think the goal is. This is what I think we're doing. Don't be surprised that people say different things. Now, again, if it's growth, then do all the members agree on which measures of growth are most relevant? So here's a case study to take a look at. A division of an industrial company was running out of manufacturing capacity for a product that was made in the United States. The leadership team assumed the desired outcome was to achieve the highest possible return on assets. So they discussed closing a plant in the United States, building a plant in China where the costs were lower and the raw materials were closer. But the parent company's desired outcome, what they really wanted, was to minimize corporate overhead and maximize earnings. That's different. So the move to China would mean closing an additional facility that supplied materials to the US plant, which would significantly lower earnings. So once the division team understood the desired outcome, it could solve the capacity problem in a way that was consistent with the parent's actual goals. So this is where the communication breakdown was the problem. Also, provide a range of options for achieving the desired outcome. It's really important to break alternatives into a broader range of options beside, accept the plan or reject the plan or defer the decision. You may want to give people many more different gradations of what would actually be acceptable. This is one of my favorite. This is called testing fences and walls. And again, this comes into how people make assumptions. When team members cite a presumed boundary, for example, a real or imagined corporate policy, we have to ask ourselves, is this roadblock that we're looking at, this obstacle, is it a wall? Meaning we can't move it? Like we have a company in China and we're only going to be working in China? Or is it a fence where we could move it? Oh, well, we are a company in China and we're going to stay in China, but maybe we could hire remote workers who are actually living in a different country, but they just tune in remotely. So they never actually move to China, but they still work for the company. It's just a digital employee. So this is where you'd actually ask yourself, how strong is that wall and is it a fence? Meaning we could actually move the wall a little bit. And this all comes down to what you assume can or cannot happen. And testing fences and walls is really fun. I actually enjoy it because people think, oh, I didn't know we could do that. Now, when teams are invited to think about options, they almost immediately focus on what they cannot do. Most people are pretty negative. They think of what they can't do, especially at the divisional level, where they may feel hemmed in by corporate policies, real or imagined. Maybe they're mind reading on what they think the manager wants, even though the manager never said that. Often the entire team not only assumes that a constraint or a wall is real, but they also shy away from even talking about it because they don't even want to go near it. Some people might think that, oh, the boss only wants ideas that are going to save money, but it can't be a solution that requires us to spend money. That's an assumption. A lot of people don't even want to talk about it because they think they'll make the boss angry. This is testing fences and walls. Double check that. Say to the boss, I'm going under the assumption that we can't spend any money. Is that true or not? And they'll give you some clarification. Now, when a team member cites a presumed boundary, my colleagues and I encourage them to ask whether it's a wall which can't be moved or a fence which can. Don't be surprised that the wall is actually a fence. Here's a case study that really helps illustrate the point. There was a division of a global financial services provider, and the executives had never considered expanding their offerings to include banking services. The reason they didn't want to go into banking is that they thought that corporate policy prohibited them doing that. They thought they weren't allowed. But when the division head tested the assumption with her boss, she learned that wasn't true. The real concern was that they just didn't want to do anything that would bring in new regulatory requirements. That was the wall. Not banking, but they thought, oh, well, banking brings in the wall of regulatory. So the division developed a new strategic option that did include several features of banking, but it didn't require banking regulations. So the wall turned into a fence. Another thing that's really important is to surface your preferences early. So if you have some ideas, get them out early before the conversation turns away from you and people have gone into a different direction. Best way to do this to make sure that everyone is heard is survey all the members before the meetings to identify their preferences and focus the subsequent discussion and also identify deadblocks. Now, the reason that we want to survey people privately before the meeting is that some of the quiet people or shy people may not want to talk into a group meeting, and there could be some really aggressive, talkative people in the meeting that make them feel like they can't speak up. So talk to those people privately and get those really good ideas. Here's another case study. A global credit card company was deciding where to invest for growth. The executive team members conducted a straw poll of countries under consideration, just kind of a quick poll. The process enabled them to quickly eliminate countries that no one voted for. So instead of saying we can go anywhere in the world, they said, what country do you like? If only 10 came up, let's focus on those 10. So this focuses the subsequent discussion on the regions where there was actually most agreement. So straw polls can be a really quick way to focus down things. Next one is called weighted preferences, and this is another way to narrow the decision-making field and help prevent the dictator by default syndrome, where you might have 10 options on the table, but you weight them, and then you start to see where most of the people are leaning. So here's another case study. There was a life and annuities division of a major insurance company, and they had developed a business plan that included a growth in profit of $360 million. That's what they wanted to do. The executive team was trying to determine which line of business would deliver that kind of growth. So instead of casting equally weighted votes for different lines of business that they could go into, each executive was given poker chips that represented $360 million, and then a grid that had different squares representing the company's products and channels. So the team members were able to distribute their chips, all chips added up to $360 million, according to where they thought project growth was likely to be found. So they could diversify where they put the money. And by watching how people piled different amounts of money on the grid, then they were able to see where people were pretty much focusing. Now, after discussing the results, they repeated the exercise and they found that some consensus actually emerged. So this is actually a fun way for people to say, oh, well, instead of choosing 10, everyone seems to be focused on these two. Why don't we just do these two? Now, by the third and final round of the exercising, the weighted voting actually helped this group narrow the discussion to just a handful of businesses and channels, like maybe 20% of the options. And then the genuine alignment began to develop among the team members, where everyone realized, oh, we're all kind of focusing on the same 2 or 3 areas. Now, equally weighted votes could have locked the executive team into the voting paradox where people didn't agree. But this technique dissolved the false equality of alternatives that's often at the root of the problem. So proposing options early and allowing people to tailor them reduces the likelihood that executives will be forced into a stalemate that the CEO has to break. And the poker chip game is actually a lot of fun, where you get to weight where you want to put your choices. So you don't have to vote on one, you get to put many votes all around. The next one, which you would think would be obvious, but it's not, is stating each option's pros and cons. A lot of people don't actually write them down and look at them and say, well, this list is really long and this isn't. So rather than engaging in exercises about giving feedback or learning how to have assertive conversations, executives can better spend their time making sure that both sides of every option are fully voiced. So you could say, all right, we're talking about buying this watch. Well, what's the pro, what's the con? Let's take out the board and actually list it out. The next one that works really well is what's called assigning a devil's advocate. A devil's advocate is someone that just always takes the opposite point of view no matter what. And this is actually really good for uncovering some things that we might be missing. So what we want to do is that you want to make a thorough and dispassionate exploration of counter arguments on an expected part of strategic deliberation. So we might all want to build the plan. You need someone that gives you all the reasons not to build the plan. You want to assign a devil's advocate to make the case against each option. Whether they agree with them or not, it doesn't matter. It's like play acting. Now, this actually helps by depersonalizing the discussion because the person taking that devil's advocate side, the opposite point of view, doesn't have to agree with it. So you don't have to blame them or not like them. That's their job. Their job is to play that role like an actor. And by depersonalizing the discussion, it also produces more nuanced strategy discussions. So you get a lot better ideas when you know that people are actually going to be taking the other side of a position. So more on the devil's advocate. An advocate for a particular option typically delivers a presentation that might contain some discussion of risk, but remains entirely the work of someone who sold on the idea. So let's say I really want to build a factory in China. That's what I want. And in my PowerPoint, I have one slide that says, well, here's some risk about doing that. That's not really what you're looking for. You need a devil's advocate that really makes 4 or 5 slides about the risk so that we can really see what the risk is, because I'm biased. I want the factory in China. Now, members of the executive team are expected to agree with the business case or attack it, although they may have only seen it a few days before the meeting, and maybe they have no way of producing an equally detailed rebuttal or offer solid alternatives. So the executive team might not really know the pros and cons, advantages or disadvantages, so having a devil's advocate role-playing can let everyone see all the good and all the bad. Now also, attacking the business case can also be perceived as attacking the person who's presenting it. So the devil's advocate, when we say, look, this person doesn't really take this position, but we want to know the opposite position, this allows people to not feel like they're being attacked. Now, frequently, the only executives with open license or open authority to ask those tough probing questions are the CEO and the chief financial officer, but even they might lack the detailed knowledge to ask those really good questions. So the devil's advocate really helps everyone get more informed. Now, also, by breaking the business case into several explicit and implicit alternatives and assigning a devil's advocate to critique each option, you can depersonalize the discussion, you can make it thorough and dispassionate counter arguments as an expected part of the deliberation, such as we know that we're going to say good stuff and bad stuff about this idea, the pro and the con. That's just what we do. Now, this approach is very valuable when the preferences of the CEO or other powerful members of the team are well known. If you're assigning a devil's advocate to each option, if that seems too cumbersome, you can try a simpler variant. Have the CEO or a meeting facilitator urge each team member to offer up 2 or 3 suggestions from the perspective of his functional area. So if you have 10 areas of expertise, each of those 10 people offer up 2 or 3 opinions on what they really are experts about. So instead of unreasonably asking executives to think like a CEO, which usually gets silence or, comments that the CEO wants to hear, this tactic puts team members on the solid ground of their expertise and transforms an unsatisfying meeting into a much more productive one. Now, teams should continue to reframe their options in ways that preserve their original intent, be it a higher return on net assets or greater growth. When they feel the impulse to shoehorn decisions into either a framework, they should step back and generate a broader range of options. Here's another case study. For instance, the executive team of a property and casualty division of a larger insurance company wanted to grow either by significantly increasing the company's share with existing agencies or by increasing the total number of agencies that sold its products. Now, before the leadership team took either path, it needed to decide whether to offer a full line of products or a narrow line. As a result, team members found themselves considering 4 business models. 1 was a full product line with existing large agencies. 2 was a narrow product line with existing large agencies. 3 was a full product line with more smaller agencies. And 4 was a narrow product line with small agencies. So we had 4 things to look at. Now, they were dissatisfied with these choices, so they broke the business down into 16 value attributes, including the brand of the company, claim service, agency compensation, price competitiveness, breadth of product offering, and agency facing technology. Now, some of these value attributes might apply to all four of the original business models, others to three or fewer. Agent facing technology, for example, is typical of working with many small agencies because their sheer numbers preclude a high touch relationship. The team then graded its company and several competitors on each attribute to find competitive openings that fit with the division's willingness and ability to invest. So instead of four static options, it now had a much larger number of choices based on different combinations of value attributes. So ultimately, it chose to bring several lagging attributes up to market standard, elevate others to above market standard, and then aggressively emphasize still others. So this turned out to be a far less radical reduction than the team had originally assumed was needed. Now, in closing, there are two essential ground rules here. You want to be able to deliberate confidentially. A secure climate for the conversation is essential to allow the team members to float those trial balloons, throw out those ideas, and cut deals. An executive who knows that her speculative remarks about closing a plant might be circulated throughout the company, meaning people are going to gossip, they might be reluctant to engage in that free play of mind that an unfettered strategy discussion would demand. So confidentiality is really important. What happens in the meeting stays in the meeting. Moreover, team members whose priorities don't prevail in the deliberations must be able to save face when the meeting's over. So if they lose something in the meeting, they don't want to walk away with everyone knowing that. So if they are known to have lost or relinquished something in the meeting that's very clear to their constituents, their future effectiveness as a leader might be undermined. So confidentiality is really important. Also deliberate over an appropriate time frame. A lot of agendas for strategy offsites contain what's called a China market strategy, where they say you have a limited amount of time, like 45 minutes for this decision. The result is a discussion that typically goes nowhere, or there could be an arbitrary decision by the CEO that's just going to override people. When new options are devised or existing ones are unbundled, team members need time to study them carefully and assess the counter-arguments. Now, breaking up the discussion into several meetings spaced widely apart and interspersed with additional analysis and research gives people a chance to reconsider their preferences. It also gives them time to prepare their constituencies for changes that are likely to emerge as a result of the new strategy. So that's our lesson, and here's your homework. You only have to choose one of these three options and write a one-page paper. Option 1. Share a time when a team discovered they were working on the wrong goal, or you thought you were doing something and turns out you should have been doing something else. 2, share a time when the fences and walls strategy could have worked, where everyone thought something was a rule that couldn't be broken or moved or changed, and it turned out you could have. That happens a lot. Number 3, what do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of the devil's advocate strategy, where someone always has to take the other side no matter what? So with these 3, this is going to start to bring today's lecture into your own real world experience, where you start to see, wow, if I had known this lesson before, we could have made a better decision. So thanks for listening. I'll see you at the next lesson. Bye-bye.